So my name is Delali Kumavie, and I'm an assistant professor in the English department. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. When I received this invitation, I thought it would be an opportunity for me to revisit an essay I wrote a few years ago in 2021 about my time in Charlottesville. So I'm going to be talking about monumental revisions, revisiting Charlottesville. I want to start with the last stanza of Natasha Trethewey's poem, which was published in her recent collection, Monument. The poem is called Elegy for Native Guards, where she writes, quote, "The Daughters of the Confederacy has placed a plaque here at the fort's entrance, each Confederate soldier's name raised hard in bronze. No names carved for the Native Guards, 2nd Regiment, Union men, black phalanx. What is monument to their legacy?" Picking up where Trethewey leaves us, I begin by asking, what is a monument? Is it a statue or a structure that attempts to remember or memorialize a person or an event? Or is it something, anything, of historical significance or interest? Or is it something that fixes in place a memory, a history, a past? Maybe it is a hauntology, which another poet, M. Nobesi Phillips, in her collection Zong, describes as, quote, "specters of the undead marking themselves present," end quote. It is where the past inserts itself into the present as a referent that still signifies imaginaries of self, community, and nation. Depending on the lens through which we approach monuments, their significance and instability are revealed, evidencing both what is represented and what is further rendered invisible or unrepresentable. Charlottesville. Upon re-entering the United States in January 2019, the white man at the immigration desk, after inquiring about my final destination, remarked that Charlottesville is beautiful. Until that moment, I had never contemplated Charlottesville's beauty. My attention had been held captive by the many monuments I encountered daily as I made my way from my apartment downtown to the University of Virginia campus. These monuments, the equestrian, these monuments, the equestrian statue of Thomas Stonewall Jackson, at Ready, the monument to a Confederate soldier, the Robert Lee Monument, and the statue of Thomas Jefferson, and the slave auction block, it seemed to me, were an inescapable part of Charlottesville's landscape. They materialized everywhere, reinterpreting the past, determining where people lived, and memorializing through material representations the self-styling of a community still living under the shadow of slavery. I had not yet found a way to look beyond them to see the beauty of Charlottesville. Many of the monuments to the Confederacy in Charlottesville were erected 4 to 5 decades after the end of the Civil War, that is between 1890 and 1920, when the political gains of Reconstruction were siphoned away and white supremacists controlled the American South. According to Wanda Rushing, these monuments embody, impose, and transmit messages about political power. They act as a material historical objects that construct a trajectory for understanding and interpreting the past as it relates to the present and the future. Throughout Charlottesville, these monuments signify the historical and aspirational past of this mid-sized Virginian city, culminating in representations of its most famous resident, Thomas Jefferson, and prominent figures of the Confederacy, such as Robert Lee. The placing of these monuments at high points across the city, elevated on plinths, surrounded by parks and clearings, mean that these Confederate monuments are positioned to be highly visible objects to allow for their long-standing representational force. While the events in Charlottesville in August 2017 highlighted these Confederate monuments, just 5 miles from downtown Charlottesville, Thomas Jefferson's estate, Monticello, which we heard about, serves as a monument to his legacy first, and secondarily to the history of slavery in Virginia. Jefferson, who in his book Notes on the State of Virginia, outlined a myth of racial difference as skin color, biological differences, and mental ability is everywhere present in Charlottesville memorial and architectural landscape. Indeed, it is in the aftermath of August 11th and 12th that the largest employer in Charlottesville and another of Jefferson's achievements, the University of Virginia, would begin to confront its history of slavery and racism and build its own monument to slavery at the university. Throughout Charlottesville and Albemarle County, monuments to slavery and Black residents are few and exist in close proximity to those that celebrate the Confederacy or Jim Crow or its leading white residents. Put differently, those Black bodies that animate these monuments, the Black bodies whose labor undergird the city's wealth, are reminded each day of their unrepresentable past. Despite the plethora of various forms of monuments, it was the site of the slave auction block pictured here in downtown Charlottesville, which in early spring 2020 became the site of reinvention led by two white residents. So on February 6th, 2020, Richard Allen, a 74-year-old white man, used a crowbar to remove the plaque commemorating the site of a slave auction block in the historic Court neighborhood in downtown Charlottesville. In his confession, reported in local news outlets, Allen underscored that his motivations were to force the city council to replace the plaque with something more noticeable, something more fitting, a monument perhaps. The removed auction block memorial was a rectangular bronze plaque cemented into the pavement in front of an old brick building known as No. 0 Court Square, located about a block and a half from City Hall. In the New York Times article about the incident, Allen is quoted to have said that he'd been considering doing something about the slave auction block for over 2 years. For several months leading up to Allen's removal of the plaque, another local activist, Richard Parks, had been underlining and crossing out the word slave on the plaque and writing above it the words human and people in chalk. Often Parks would leave flowers on or near the sidewalk where the slave auction plaque was located. The unintended, nonetheless provocative result of Parks' striking through the word slave was to authorize through inscription that the term slave denotes something or someone other than human. On the other hand, Parks' unintentionally re-emphasizes that the slave is distinct from, perhaps even excised from the category of the human, socially dead, subject to gratuitous violence, and natal alienated. On the other hand, Parks assumes that being human is universal without considering the ways in which Black humanity, as Zakiya Jackson puts it, is burdened with the specter of abject animality and thus assimilation into the category of universal humanity should not be equated with Black freedom. The representational apparatus that Parks mobilizes attempts to thrust upon the enslaved a humanity from which they are always already excised, by canceling out and later replacing slave with human, as we see in the homemade plaque that he made. Parks constricts the past the conditions of the slave, leaving only its traces in the human. Parks' homemade sign for the empty space is a strange irony in replacing one form of representation for another. Whereas the first monument keeps vague the temporal markers of slavery, Parks' plaque, by proclaiming an end to slavery in 1865, creates a teleological narrative which identifies a beginning and end to slavery. It affirms the myth that emancipation ended slavery, allowing the inheritors of slavery's capital to be absolved of any obligations or complicity. It leaves out the many ways that the systemic and structural economy of slavery continues under other guises in Charlottesville, the United States, and the world at large. It is as a response to this temporally bounded understanding of slavery that Calvin Warren avers that slavery is, quote, an event horizon that expresses itself in endless disguise through a time outside duration, Black time, end quote. Warren's understanding that slavery cannot be bounded within a linear temporal logic because it possesses an unsettling lifespan that is continually regenerated, reborn, and Reincarnated elucidates why Parks's attempts at memorialization fails to grapple with slavery's ongoing presence at the site of the auction block. Attempts to memorialize slavery is too often caught in a time trap that insists on beginnings and ends. These pitfalls into continuity and progression cannot comprehend, as Saidiya Hartman does in The Time of Slavery when she writes, "Then and now coexist. We are coeval with the dead." Cape Coast. This summer, as I walked through the dungeons of Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Castle, stepping in the blood, shit, and tears that form a thick ground layer of the dungeons, struggling to listen to the droning of the tour guides as they narrated their script, all I saw was Charlottesville. Not the landscape of Charlottesville, but the trajectory of memory that followed a teleological narrative of capture, middle passage, slavery, freedom, and one-day return. This narrative reproduced a logic of memory and remembrance that further displaced those it sought to remember. Further, it recast the memorialization of slavery as an economy-building strategy that would support the work of the nation-state. This practice of monumentalizing renders invisible those it attempts to remember. The Haitian scholar Michel Rouve-Trio writes that, quote, "Slavery is a ghost, both the past and the living present, and the problem of historical representation is how to represent that ghost," end quote. If the ghost of the modern world, the enslaved, cannot be represented in history on monuments, where might we find them? Toni Morrison, in an interview about Beloved, stated that her work sought to create a monument to slavery because there was simply nowhere else. She continued by saying, and I quote, "Because such a place doesn't exist that I know of, the book had to. But I didn't know that before or while I wrote it. I can see now what I was doing on the last page. I was finishing the story, transfiguring and disseminating the haunting with which the book begins. Yes, I was doing that, but I was also doing something more. I think I was pleading for that wall or that bench or that tower or that tree when I wrote the final words," end quote. If Beloved is the literary equivalent of a monument, where the ghost of slavery becomes embodied, then what does it reveal to us about monuments? How does Morrison's narrative world subvert the time trap of memory through Beloved's indecipherable language, or the chokeberry tree on Sethi's back that intermingles the routine violence of slavery with unforgettable images and language? Is the literary text then an attempt to serve as an insistent reminder that the work of monumentalizing, while fraught with erasure, is also layered and complicated and produced in language as well as images? I want to end with another poet, one I know who found himself on an airplane both times the United States invaded Iraq. During Desert Storm, he was on the plane flying into London. And in the poem he wrote about, he concludes by saying, quote, "And when it is all over, we shall once more inherit a generation of cracked souls, for whom we must erect new monuments and compose new anthems of praise, and the eternal hope of life, beyond the recurring stupidity of war heroes," end quote. But if we have learned anything from Charlottesville or Cape Coast, then the new monuments we compose and create must deal with the ghost whose presence complicates our attempts to remember. Thank you.